Today we are talking about some common mistakes that many houseplant beginners make, including me. So the first one is going to be using a really dense soil or using a garden soil. This is a really common mistake that beginners make, and in fact when I first started with plants, before I properly got into plants, I myself just used pure dense soil. So what you want to do instead is add some soil amendments, some things like perlite, orchid bark, pumice, all this good stuff, because what this does is it adds to the drainage in the soil and it allows the roots to breathe as well. And yeah, this just makes the soil better draining and it puts your plants at less risk of root rot. So number two actually relates a little bit to root rot as well, and that is using a pot that is too large. I myself, right at the beginning of my plant journey, before it was a proper hobby, I would put my plants in bigger pots thinking that they would grow bigger if I did that, and it sounds a bit silly to me now because I know better, but to someone who absolutely has no idea about plants, they might not know that. I certainly didn't. So you want to make sure that the pot is just like maybe an inch or so bigger than the root ball, and when you repot as well, make sure you only upsize by 1 to 2 sizes bigger. And another potting mistake that many beginners make is to use a pot that does not have drainage holes. So it's really important to choose a nursery pot with drainage holes so that when you water your plant, the excess water can drain out of the pot. You can still use a nice cover pot, but just put your nursery pot inside the pretty cover pot and then take it out when you water it. Let the water drain off and then pop the nursery pot back into your decorative cover pot. So probably one of the biggest mistakes that beginner houseplant parents make, and one that I myself made too, is to overwater your plants. And the reason we do this is just because we think we're doing a good thing for our plants. We think that water is good, and if we give them lots of water, that's going to make them happy. But in reality, it can actually be bad for your plant to overwater it. And when I talk about overwatering, I'm talking about the frequency of watering, not the amount of water you put in. So when you water your plant, you can give it a really good deep drink and make sure all of the soil is saturated. But overwatering then occurs if you water your plant again before it's ready to be watered. So just make sure you let your soil dry out a bit before you water again. Another really common beginner mistake, and one that I sometimes still make myself, is not giving your plants enough light. Never underestimate the importance of light when it comes to healthy houseplants. It is absolutely paramount. So if you notice your plant isn't really growing very much, it's growing smaller leaves, maybe it's even stopped growing or it's getting yellowing leaves, maybe you're not giving it enough light. So try moving it nearer to a window, or if you don't have a good natural light, you could always get some grow lights too. And another thing to pay attention to, and this is something that beginners often overlook, I certainly wasn't aware of this when I started, is you also need to make sure that you keep your plants' leaves clean. And the reason for this is because if they are covered in dust, this hinders their ability to photosynthesize, and they aren't able to photosynthesize as much. So just make sure from time to time you give your plants a good wipe with a microfiber cloth, or you could even take them in the shower now and again, give them a good shower down and clean the leaves that way. And that brings me on to the next one, which is not bothering to check for pests and kind of burying your head in the sand when it comes to the idea of pests. I definitely did this one when I was a complete beginner to plants. I just hated the idea of pests, and I preferred to bury my head in the sand and just not bother at all checking for them. And this is a really huge mistake, because with pests, it's best to catch them early. The earlier you catch them, the more chance you've got of your plant surviving. But if you don't catch it early, then the infestation can get out of hand and you can lose your plant. So try not to be scared of pests or worry too much about them. They're just part of having houseplants. And what I just told you about cleaning the leaves as well, this really ties into pest prevention. If you clean your leaves regularly, This can prevent pests from taking hold in the first place because it washes off any pests. But yeah, if you do see pests, just make sure you treat the plant for pests, and I'll put a link in the description to the pest spray that I make myself. It's really easy to make at home, really easy and cheap. Yeah, just treat it with that every few days for about sort of 5 to 6 weeks. That's what I usually do. And don't forget to clean the backs of the leaves as well as the fronts, because most pests tend to hang out on the backs. You will see them on the fronts too, but where they really like to hang out is on the backs. So make sure you don't forget to keep the backs clean and treat the backs of the leaves when you do need to treat a pest infestation. So another mistake that loads of beginners make is they get really over enthusiastic and they end up buying loads and loads of plants all at once, and then they feel overwhelmed. So I would suggest maybe starting off with just a handful of plants and letting yourself ease in gently, because if you have too many plants to care for, it can kind of put you off because you've got too much to do. So maybe just start out by gently buying a few, see how you go with those, and introduce more plants kind of gradually. And the next one is kind of tied into the previous mistake, and that is buying the wrong type of plants for your environment, or buying difficult plants. And yes, I'm talking about calatheas. My first, well, not my first houseplant, but one of my first, like my first proper considered purchase from a garden centre was a calathea. It was a Calathea lepidina, and yeah, it just slowly perished because calatheas are really difficult to look after, but most beginners are kind of attracted to them because they're really readily available, they're very pretty, and we tend to want to start with those. So I would say start with some plants that are more hardy. So don't go for alocasias, don't go for calatheas, go for some more kind of hardy species that are known for being really tough and resilient. Also make sure to remember to pick plants that are suited to your environment. So if you have a really low light environment, you may want to choose plants specifically designed for lower light. Or if you live in a really hot country, you may want to look for plants that are good with higher temperatures, that kind of thing. So another big mistake is to not check your plants for repotting. It's really important to repot plants when they become root bound, because what can happen is when a plant is outgrowing its pot, it can actually start to lose leaves. Leaves can start to yellow off. It may even stop growing too. This happens to me quite a lot. So it's really important to check your plants. I usually check mine, say, once a year at the beginning of spring. I try to do it. Check if your plant needs a bigger pot and up pot as necessary. Make sure you only go 1 to 2 sizes bigger though, because you don't want to go too big, because that could lead to root rot, because there'll be too much soil around the roots and this could hold too much water, and that's what can lead to rot. Another mistake is not isolating new plants when you bring them home. Now, this is for pest prevention. Often you'll come home from a nursery and a new plant will have pests on it and you won't know, and they will jump over to your existing plants. So it is advisable, if you have a space for quarantining new plants, to just quarantine your new plant for a couple of weeks, maybe even 3, and just check them on a daily basis. Check the backs of the leaves, the fronts of the leaves, see if there are any signs of pests or pest damage. You're looking for things like mottled leaves, brown spots, stickiness, yellowing, stuff like that, and the pests themselves as well. If you see specks on your plant and you're not sure if it's a pest, just give it a poke with your fingernail, and if it's a pest it will move. I tend to find spider mites like to whiz around a lot, but sometimes some pests like thrips, they might stay still a bit more and you need to kind of poke them. But yeah, just keep an eye on your new plant, and then when you're sure that it doesn't have any pests, you can reintroduce it into the population with your existing plants. So another mistake I made when I was a beginner is I was too afraid to prune my plants, and this is because cutting off bits of your plant, it kind of goes counterproductive to what you want to do, isn't it, where you want to make your plants grow more. But actually, in many cases, pruning your plants can actually stimulate further growth, and in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, it can actually promote branching in a plant and you will get an even bushier plant still. So Don't be afraid to give your plant a prune. This could well stimulate growth. And also, if you see any kind of yellow, brown leaves, it's absolutely fine to go ahead and cut those off. It's certainly not going to harm the plant if you don't cut them off, but I usually chop them off just for aesthetic purposes. It looks nicer when plants are nice and pruned. It's not going to hurt your plant. The plant's going to be absolutely fine, I promise you. So one more tip before I go, and that is tap water. Often we use tap water to water our plants, and indeed I do use tap water to water many of my plants, but there are just some plants that are a little bit too sensitive that you might want to consider using either filtered water is what I use, or some people use distilled water or rainwater. I don't have access to those, but I do filter my water because that filters out some of the minerals and things, the chlorine, that kind of thing that plants don't like, because some of the stuff that's in our tap water, it may lead to kind of browning bits on leaves. I really hope you found today's beginner tips helpful, and if you've made any of these mistakes, don't worry, you're not alone. We all make them. I've made every single mistake on this list. We learn as we go along, but hopefully this might help you avoid some of the pitfalls that you haven't faced yet. I do hope it helps, and if it did help you, give it a thumbs up, and until next time guys, take care.